There we go. Hey there, hi there, oh there. Uh, Welcome to This and That on the 29th of June. We started yesterday. Well, we're another 2 days into the post debate stuff. And I will have to say that Biden was much more energetic in his speech in North Carolina. And very close to the kind of energy that he had during State of the Union. And if a transcript of the a debate gets released, I think you'll see that it had a little bit more. The text itself is more interesting. It's unfortunate that in delivery, Biden was not quite all together. And but I think at a textual level, when you see it in text form, it actually looks pretty interesting. And yes, he made a lot of gaffes, but the count was that mistruths, there were 9 for Biden and 30 for Trump. So as you know, every couple of minutes, Trump cranks out a lie. It's just that's just Trump.
He's industrious.
Industrious, indeed. Anyway, yesterday was the 28th, and we began with some ideas I've been fiddling around with and trying to explain them not only to myself, but to others, and to take as it were, a Hegelian approach to look at these different opposing or complementary viewpoints, ones that try to raise the question about Marx moving to a kind of abstract idea about value, and then going to explain how is it that surpluses are created, and that's sort of the article that I'll finish off today. And it gets a little far afield, but it does represent an entire body of information or theories, as it were, in terms of um, post-war, post-World War II Marxist thought. The idea is that, how is it that we can explain things in a broader way, a more humanistic way than simply thinking about a more mechanical, orthodox approach to Marxism, which is what dominated the middle of the 20th century and was very important. It's not unimportant. Um, you know, the issues of a um, uh, international communism, a dialectical materialist approach, were very important to a lot of people because it was a way of critiquing a chaotic capitalism in the interwar period and was fairly powerful. But as you can see, and what was problematic for the Frankfurt School more specifically, is how fascism did what it did. Um, and succeeded in a world that had a somewhat viable Soviet Union. So that you can see that people not in the Soviet Union would have to come up with various ideas about it. And this returns, of course, in the post-war period. The 1956 speech actually was pretty important when Khrushchev threw essentially threw Stalin under the bus on the one hand. On the other hand, you have the imposition of more power in Hungary and then ultimately Czechoslovakia and all of these things going on. Terrible, terrible in the sense of uh, creates a lot of problems for folks and particularly those who have organized themselves into parties or political parties or groups or whatever, and the kind of sectarian divisions that we often see, we continue to see, that are part of a quote unquote democratic process, remain a kind of problematic idea, uh, for some people it seems heretical to think of to oppose a dictatorship of the proletariat in one sense, to oppose democratic centralism, it is difficult for some folks, particularly those who have grown up with a much broader sense of democratic socialism. That's always the kind of tension that occurs. So what I've been fiddling around with is at the theoretical level, in terms of describing capital, because in fact we do need to have a critique of capital to reconcile it with the kind of ideological disputes that we have nearly every day. And to understand some of the ideas that have come from this discourse. That is, if self-valorizing value, value that gives birth to value, helps to create surplus value, it is the basis for surplus. But we need to get a sense of what's underlying this self-valorizing, as it were. Now, some people will interpret this in the post-war period as being kind of trying to come to grips with the kind of existential problems that occurred at the end of World War II. Nuclear weapons create a certain kind of point of view for some people, particularly Western Marxism. They come to grips with a lot of different things, not only the recovery of Europe using the same kind of capitalist tools that were there kind of before it all got screwed up, and so that's problematic as well. Certain type of control of the developments of the concept of the state, the emergence of a critique of state capitalism, and to see that it kind of some folks were trying to stick it out, others were still developing, and it becomes problematic. On the other hand, marketizing an economy, as in the Chinese case, allowed it to grow much better in the post-war period. In the Russian case, it well, you could argue that it brought down communism, quote unquote. Other things I think were at work there, but probably a never reconciling the Stalinist tradition in some ways, because it's always sort of been there. It's still there now in the operation of a lot of things. It's certainly clear that the propaganda apparatus is now pretty similar to the same kinds of disinformation activity that occurred in the Stalinist period. So that's not to say that they're Stalinists. I think they're in a very weird kind of position where oligarchs run the country. A subset of those oligarchs are the ones that have been co-opted by Putin, and it is generally sort of a big resource dependent kind of or sort of a mineral extracting country, largely, that has badly developed its industrial sector, let's put it that way. So anyway, so does value and how does capital operate in this particular context? And I went through a lot of arm waving about what this self-valorizing might look like. The fact is that it is a intermediating kind of idea, that it requires multiple subject-object relations, a bunch of exchanges. It proceeds in that sense beyond simple exchange, but sort of exchange with greater action, and it parallels the idea that in language, for example, we have a simple communicative, declarative relations. On the other hand, we have rhetorical things that we try to engage with a kind of force, and that parallels itself, I think, in a larger economic sense. Similarly, if we draw a relation between things that seem dissimilar, we can see that they're still kind of connected. The idea of self-valorizing capital and modern monetary theory are connected. It's just that money, of course, is only one step in this larger view of what are a commodity analysis, the analysis of the commodity, more, the abstract idea of the commodity and the commodity relation, the idea of the formation of a commodity, and particularly in the case of post-war French thought, It is the idea of commodity fetishism, and the idea of fetishism, in fact, not simply as an anthropological idea, but as something which does motivate culture. And it's a way of framing certain kinds of ideas. Now, this is where the analysis verges into the psychoanalytic, or to, it's philosophical in that sense, in the sense that, you're trying to figure out, well, what is it that motivates people to do these things? Does the market itself do it? Or is it a question we ask about individuals, about their individual sort of the differentiation between needs and desires? Now, does the market do that? Does its various elements like marketing or merchandising or whatever, advertising, all of those things sort of relate to that? Needless to say, the Frankfurt School is addressing exactly those same issues on the question of culture, and that's kind of the we haven't invented a battle between or this straw thing called cultural Marxism that is everybody needs an enemy, and that's the current demon, I guess, at work, and of course a total misreading of, it's like these people never went to college. It's just so stupid. But anyway, needless to say, there's no direct connection, but it is all about indirect connection. And it's not simply about the money form. The money is clearly part of it, but it's still about capital. It's still about all of the other things that are part of this. Money is simply helps to make it flow. It is a means by which, that's why currency flows in that particular sense. And so, we're still in a kind of critical period. In some ways, the MMT functions to help bring left-oriented folks into the discourse. It represents a way of people in the post-Keynesian way, in terms of post-Keynesian thought, try to refine the view of the state as something in control of a lot of things, like fiscal policy, as I tried to point out, that we're just still doing military Keynesianism when we support Ukraine, which in the short run may at least allow Ukraine to have a certain degree of sovereignty, but you got to weigh that, as I'll talk about in a moment, got to weigh that against corruption, because Ukraine was one of the more corrupt countries in Europe, maybe perhaps relative to elsewhere as well, before we got into this whole business. It's always had that kind of issue, partially built because of a post-Soviet system. That's part of it. It's a pretty disruptive thing, and a lot of manipulation went on. The Budapest, whatever it is, agreement, taking away their nuclear weapons, which, were really, Soviet weapons. So in some ways, it was never really supposed to be there in that context, in terms of the Ukrainians. And then you have the underlying issues of all the different cultural elements that make up Ukraine. But there is, and Ukrainian nationalism, of course, being very problematic relative to Russia, because it's so deeply engaged with each other. But I don't think it's any different than, for example, and probably a bad example, but the United States and Canada. So, and we're not quite ready to take over Canada, although we keep talking about it. So that's sort of interesting. Anyway, the Hajdini's article, Capitalism and Repetition, Marx and Lacan, represents a kind of extension of certain ideas that are still there. And they're still reasonable ideas in the sense that we're looking at this larger motivation issue. And I've tried to use the index, that is something that is not quite palpable. That is, you have some referent, you have something, perhaps an object, but what you have more importantly is a larger collection of a cognition, as it were, of certain ideas. So to go back to the tire tread business, the tire tread is an impression on the earth, et cetera, but it also, because of context, implies that a car was there, a specific type of car, blah, 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 all of those things that you would look at in a detective procedural. But that is what it's about. It's about process. It's about procedure. It's about this set of interaction. And it is, as this article discusses, a kind of repetition. That is, it repeats itself, and not unlike propaganda itself. It only works, in fact, with repetition. And you oppose it with this idea of barter in the ideal sense, that exchange is a kind of a perfect, as it were, exchange, and there is no, it's probably impossible in the barter context, more possible in the monetary context. So that's where, if you want to think about how capital operates, it needs money to make this kind of idea of equivalence, and therefore is modernizing in that sense, that it's democratizing in some ways. It makes people more equal, whatever that might mean. I mean, in its most radical form, I suppose, is if you hold a mortgage, you hold some kind of equivalence, but in effect, if you sort of screw up on the payments or whatever, the illusion disappears, and you lose your property. So it links all these things together. But as I say, to go back to this idea of a kind of motive or motivation, to look at it as a kind of post-Freudian, as it were, kind of model of thinking about what drives people to do stuff. So I use the word motivation. Lacan probably describes it, and it's more complicated than that. Idea of drives and the kind of way in which we talk about an economy. And so French structuralism or post-structuralism asks those kinds of questions, applies them not simply at the level of individual psychoanalysis, but instead applies it to the sort of mass cultural thing. How is it that we can read much larger kinds of things with it? More specifically, Marx's model of capital. And combining that is what Zizek's about. Zizek combines that among other things, and he's still useful in that sense. And you have people like Deleuze, Guattari, Hart and Negri. They're all asking the same question: how is it that we can apply this kind of model, which might point towards communism, whatever that is, point to a more fair or more equitable kind of solution, or a less hierarchical or an anti-hierarchical solution, anti-hegemonic, etc. This is, we're trying to work out the details. And so Gilles Deleuze is one of many people who tries to think this idea about basic anthropological and applied in the sense that you try in the post-Freudian sense, the application of certain ideas about the mind, i.e., in the Levi-Strauss sense, the savage mind, as an anthropological concept, becomes applied much more generally. And the capitalist mind sort of still works in those kinds of ways. The advantage of having somebody like Trump there is that, because he's really superego is really quite wild there. We tend to see these little glimpses of insanity, of that, he doesn't hide his deceptions. His deceptions are are sort of, on the one hand, obvious, on the other hand, quite insidious. So repetition to gift and theft, which are altogether withdrawn from circulation and thus escape the laws of exchange, are attainable only through their transgression. So this idea is about, remember, we've talked about antagonisms, that transgression and antagonism. We have all of these kinds of pieces of force, this idea of a certain type of force, not necessarily a physical force, but more psychic force at work, which is what Freud was sort of interested in, these kinds of things that move people to do stuff. And this paper deals with repetition, but and on a developing from Deleuze, but tries to apply it much more directly, or at least to explain it perhaps to himself, uh, how Marxian it is. That because often when you read stuff like Deleuze Guattari or Hart and Negri, they're dealing with some big ideas. That is, that capitalism represents a certain schizophrenic state, and that implies a whole bunch of other readings about what things are. And unfortunately, you can read them through, sort of terrible politicians. That's essentially American carnage, is what Trump has been trying to describe since his inaugural, as a kind of, and I mean, he doesn't use the term, but it's essentially a schizophrenic belief about America. I mean, he believes that there's much more chaos than there actually is. There's actually less crime, less violent crime. There are all these incredible contradictions. Now, it is true that the details are much more problematic, but it has to be seen in context. I mean, relative to total population, et cetera, regions, and that kind of stuff. Yes, the highest. The number one, or the primary cause, or the highest cause of child homicides is gun use. So this is, or childhood death. Let's say I think that's the way the figure is described. So yes, it is a problematic matter, but it is also, with respect, relatively small, although more dramatic, certainly, in all of its contexts. And solving that problem is a whole different set of policy issues, but it is certainly is based in some idea about the regulatory state, which is kind of, it's a psychiatric idea. Similarly, the overthrow of or the reversal on Chevron as a piece of administrative procedure, or a control on administrative agencies, and forcing it back into the courts rather than having administrative agencies sort of solve some problems. On the one hand, it appears like there's originally, or in its inception, there is the claim that it's some deep state faceless bureaucrat, and it's certainly possible that state capitalism can sort of operate that way. On the other hand, what other way are going to regulate some of the most serious issues that are even more insidious than certain other things that seem to be at the front of our consciousness, like children having access to guns, etc. So, Marx is about not so much repetition in its object in the at the kind of psychiatric sort of level, but to look at it in a much larger kind of context. So that's what this article tries to work through. It's not simply about transgression, and it is beyond the economy of gift and theft. A theft is to look at it in sort of structural terms, is a displacement of location. If something is stolen from somebody else, and if property is 9/10 of the law, I'm just using the cliche, don't worry, it's it's not that rigorous. On the one hand, those ideas are actually important. You can see how they're badly used in a variety of instances. The stand your ground, for example, is a kind of property issue as well. That is, the property of the self being violated. And in the Florida case, for example, rather than castle theory, that is defending your house against intruders, to move it, and this is the repetition and movement issue, you move it into the street, like George Zimmerman, self was being attacked by, and he was justified in defending himself, even though he was the only person with a gun. Poor Trayvon Martin was armed with a can of iced tea and Skittles. So it's just, on its face is problematic, but it is, just sad to see the kind of Florida man law at work. So anyway, we talked yesterday about uh, applying the formula, the MCM. It implies a repetition. So we saw that as a kind of way in which it is about cycling, about repetition. Um, uh, that is, there's a certain degree of transgression that exists in the interaction of certain cycles. Um, it is, you know, the problem is a quantity quality question. And so if the goal is to have a homogeneous exchange value that is a more equitable or a more ideal, let's say, I mean, this is just simply the same explanation about perfect competition. In fact, you could argue that way, and it would be a sort of an amusing way to do it, but I'm not doing it. So the quality quantity problem it still exists in explaining capital. And so it raises the same thing that we were looking at in terms of applying Hegel to Marx, and that is the issue of universals and particulars, things that can be more generalized, and things that happen on a not necessarily a one-to-one basis, but at a moment-to-moment basis, and particularly in a society where you have lots of these things going on at the same time, and they can be generalized or aggregated. So value is not identical to money. Money is a way of, as Trump says, keeping score, but it represents a kind of, it is self-valorizing in that sense that new value gets to be created from it. And so when Trump steals $10,000 from his educational foundation to buy a portrait of himself, a really crappy portrait, needless to say. He buys a speed portrait. That's a whole nother story. But anyway, you can see how that's a kind of misuse of funds designated for educational purposes, philanthropically educational purposes. And so it is so self-valorizing in the sense that it's self-aggrandizement like Trump is. And needless to say, thanks to David Fahrenhold, there is no Trump Foundation anymore. But it is this idea that you can misidentify perhaps the generalities involved. That is, money and commodity are abstractions, but they are more generalized. But it is this question of sort of figuring out what's going on here in terms of movements. And of course, there's a little side note here about commodity aesthetics. And if I were going to redo all my courses, this is one thing that I would probably try to introduce further, is a thing on commodity aesthetics. But anyway, it is a movement. It's a movement of exchange, that exchange occurs, but the exchange occurs in cycles. That's where repetition comes in. This is where the kind of translation issues are at issue. And so capital has multiple modes, multiple circuits. There is intersection and union among these things. And it is as described here, it's a cross subject. Capital is situated at the crossing point between will and have been in their very interval. As soon as it becomes something that has already passed, as soon as its interstitial or interstitial, yeah, that's right, or interval nature reaches the point of completion and ceases to function as capital and is reduced to the mere money form. And that's the whole business here, the structure that Harry Cleaver talks about. There's a certain structure, but it moves to the next level of structure, and it becomes, not necessarily something else, but it becomes read as something else. And that's why I've introduced this idea of a certain kind of gap or, cognition kind of thing that indexicality tells us, at least in the language form. So indexicality says, well, it's over there, you point toward it, and that's the kind of indexicality that operates at the language level. It's on the left of me, it's on the right of me, it happened before, it happened after. These are spatio-temporal kind of things that locate one's discourse kind of in material reality. You create context for these things. It's a framing operation. Indexicality is that kind of thing. You only understand it within the proper frame. You have 50 tire tracks there, and how is it that you're going to figure out it's the bad guy? Well, how is it that procedurals operate? It's the freshest tire track, and then you save it by taking an impression of it, and then you have to go through this entire database search to figure out, well, those kind of tires were only on these types of vehicles and blah, blah, blah. Money is capital only retroactively as the subject that triggers the movement of the entire process. Capital is the retroactive result of its own movement. So these are layers of abstraction. Money is that intermediary commodity form that helps form the much larger issue of capital, because we know that capital is a bunch of other things. Capital is, buildings, machines, labor power, a bunch of other things. And so that's where trying to explain in this article how we get to M prime, which is delta M plus M. That is the M plus the change, as in calculus, any kind of change. And this is where Marx and marginal utility theory is actually kind of combines. And Marx is sort of there. He just needed to, sort of have to do a little bit more math, and he was doing it. So we know it was sort of there in his brain. So as soon as the final magnitude of value, M prime, is withdrawn from circulation, as soon as it is fixed in the mere money form, thus ceasing to function as transitive or processing value, it also ceases to function as capital. So this is this idea of live and dead things. That is why a capitalist who withdraws his or her capital from circulation is immediately transformed into a Schatzbildner, a treasure builder, or a miser. This is the money bin, Scrooge McDuck's money bin. She or he is transformed into the pre-modern rich man or woman who hoards and saves money without possessing a single atom of capital. The treasure builder saves money by saving it from circulation. The capitalist withdraws it from circulation by throwing it into it. And in fact, even in the Scrooge McDuck story, there's a correction or an addition to the meaning of the money bin or Scrooge McDuck's wealth, and implying that he has other investments besides the money bin. But the money bin is as the proxy for wealth, as the symbol or icon for wealth, swimming in money. He takes a swim in the money bin, right? If you've watched enough cartoons. It's also the Beagle Boys, who they never take a shave. They have sort of interesting numbers, 716, 617. They have all kinds of permutations of those numbers, which is also interesting from a different point of view. And they're constantly trying to, pillage the money bin. But anyway, for Deleuze, repetition is the direct opposite of exchange, which is always an exchange of equivalents. But in the passage quoted above, he immediately moves on to link repetition into theft and gift. A gift is something that we talked about theft a little bit there, Beagle Boys et al. But also gifts. When you gift something to someone, you do think about how appropriate the gift is for the receiver of your gift. But gifts are always kind of, they represent a certain kind of desire. And it's certainly clear that at a very transactional level, I bought you dinner. Are you going to come across, in its most vulgar form? That's what Trump does, right? He buys women furniture. He thinks that's innocent. That's the innocent gift because it's a domestic thing. And he brags about it. And, there's a whole biographical thing that talks about the buying of furniture and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, which are also altogether withdrawn from circulation and thus escape the laws of exchange and are attainable only through their transgression. Needless to say, that's what Trump does with Eugene Carroll. He does talk about buying her something. That's the exchange from her point of view. There was this thing he wanted to accompany her while she was going to try something on, and then he attacks her. I mean, they first meet on the bottom floor of whatever it is, Saks or Bergdorf or whatever. He but then they wind up on the upper floors, and that's when he attacks her. In every respect, repetition is a transgression, reads one of the catchwords of this. Anyway, so I better skip ahead because this is what we covered yesterday. And the question is, of course, Marx's wagers to show how the sum of money advanced and thrown into circulation can undergo augmentation without undermining the laws of commodity exchange, or to put it differently, how equivalent exchange, equitable exchange, can produce a surplus without equivalent as the lever of repetition. That is, there's an asymmetry. What this goes back to the motivation issue. What is, you want to get more stuff, and this is this wealth formation thing that is pre-capitalist, and you want to sort of get a sense of, well, what is it about that kind of moves that forward? The transformation of money into capital has to be developed on the basis of the immanent laws of the exchange of commodities in such a way that the starting point is the exchange of equivalents. So that's a kind of rule that's built in a kind of post-feudal way. Feudal ways are a kind of, relations are established from above, enclosures, dividing up land, etc. They're not done in a democratic way, and they're not done from bottom up. They're usually done top down. So money represents a similar kind of set of, relations. It is, it's not about circulation. It can circulate within itself. This is the techno-feudal idea that we're at this moment where we're back to enclosures of a certain kind, some that are incredibly problematic. The NFT is a kind of perfect example of an enclosure that is problematic. We don't know what it's really truly worth. And in fact, once you look at an NFT, you wonder, well, why the hell is this even created? That's another question. Its object is a paradoxical part of no part of circulation. The surplus is not the result of a transgression, not simply an element external to circulation, but rather its extimate element, the site of its inner otherness, which eludes the opposition between exchange and repetition, between generality and singularity, between equivalence and incommensurability. So this is all by way of explaining the internal development of more value. As the example here, the comparison made to a fractal. That is, as the fractal geometry grows, it actually increases the length. So it spirals in, but also at one level of math, it spirals in, but it also expands. That is and the simple example, as I've mentioned before, is fractal coastlines that and there are articles on this in the early development of applying fractal geometry to computer-generated imagery. That is, you can create more detail, but not necessarily have something extended in outside dimensions. That is, in its inner dimensions, it actually gains more length. The length of a coastline is much longer, like Norway, than what it appears. You can draw maps, for example, that generalizes certain elements of the coastline, and that's fine. Visually, that's what it looks like. But when you get down to the real details, there's a lot more meandering of the edge of what would count as coastline. Let's put it that way. And fractal geometry helps to model that in a way that is easily applicable to computer rendering. Anyway, without getting into the details of it. So now the way that let's just hold that for a moment. And so we're kind of expanding certain ideas or values. Now, where Lacan comes in is the idea of jouissance as a kind of modeling something that's happening, a desire, as it were, play. Deleuze presupposes an antinomian relation between signifier and jouissance. He proceeds from their radical incommensurability. A signifier is a negative relational entity, the value of which relies solely on the difference in relation to all the other signifiers. That's an important point, is that, it is the limit to zero thing we were talking about. The exchangeability of commodities relies on a signifying abstraction from their use value. Commodities are commodities because they enter mutual relations. They require this motion, that of which repetition is one. The value substance of a particular commodity existing only in its communication with other commodities. Putting it another way, value is a form and not a substance. This is the value form issue. This is the moment of abstraction. And this is the reason why you create a commodity. It's not so much an object, it's what it quote unquote represents, that it has other, a constellation of possible meanings. It could be a gift. It could be copped. It could be stolen. At the other end of the translatability and exchangeability of commodities as exchange values, we encounter enjoyment as the lever of repetition beyond equivalent exchange. That is, repetition relying on an object without equivalent, repetition conceived by Deleuze in terms of theft and gift. In contrast to this, Marx conceives of enjoyment as the increment of the functioning of the capitalist discourse. He sees it as a discursive surplus that is related to the signifier, and which implies no transgression of those forms that determine the capitalist social bond. It's no coincidence that Lacan's most thorough analysis of the capitalist discourse is to be found in the seminar that marks the aforementioned reconceptualization of jouissance. As it is no coincidence that in the reconceptualization, Lacan abundantly refers to Marx and explicitly links the concept of surplus enjoyment to Marx's notion of surplus value. One of the central theses of Lacan's seminar 17 is that enjoyment does not result from transgression, and that capitalism as a specific discourse of the extraction of surplus value is precisely the ultimate example of this logic. Sparking joy is something different than objects. You could go further than that. And if you have a fixed space, you certainly are not being quite as happy when you have too much stuff. Needless to say, talking about Joe's regrets about accumulation. So now there's a whole section in here that just verges off into a little, the rest of this article has problematic elements, and I leave it to you to sort of work through where, they're trying to explain why is it that, and makes reference to a kind of occult kind of thing in reference to fantasy and perversion. And that kind of operates, with all due respect, in marketing, advertising, merchandising, etc. So there are certain things that appear to be that may simply be illusory, and that's formed in a variety of ways. And you can see the dynamic created by this in terms of an alternation between what is a commodity and what is money, and money as a commodity, which is kind of the further argument, which explains capital fetish. And I know that seems complicated, but I think you can see that. You can see that engaged in, the Met Gala. How is it that you can attend the Met Gala? Well, you can attend the Met Gala if you're part of a group that can organize itself to donate $50,000 essentially to charity. And you need to decide how you're going to do that, but you can actually, that's the ticket. It's a philanthropic thing. You can write it off in certain kinds of ways. There's even ways, I think, as an educational thing, you can sort of do that level degree of philanthropy. That's the more benign elements of it. I mean, obviously, it's there about the fashion and spectacle and blah, blah, blah. And fortunately, it gained even more capital by being part of a television spectacle. You know, the Met Gala never used to be televised. I mean, there's been years of not being televised. The Met Gala was always is never a complete video event as a program, as a piece of programming. It was always just simply some sort of reportage. That is, you had still pictures of the fashions and gossip, and that's pretty much all that it was. And it gets moves further on. So let me finally get to, as I've unfortunately gone over time, and I really truly didn't get to the end. Let me say that the next element tries to explain in a much more complicated way how you get to self-valorizing. And it gets a little deep in here that it is talking about desire, and people will say that, well, it's all subjective and very personal. But the fact is, you know, how is it that you can have larger industries about desire, right? That is, you can have commodities that address or track or develop complex elements of desire, and of course valorize themselves, right? Let's see. Padma Lakshmi was a model before she became a cooking host, and she's not doing that anymore and doing something else. But it's interesting to see that those other elements are interacting, you know, where food becomes fashionable, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. There's food in fashion, blah, blah, blah. All of these elements are sort of at play. You know, the Bravo channel itself is that kind of weird capital fetish. Housewives of you name it, Dubai being the most bizarre, I think. Anyway, point is, it's trying to work through this basic thing, which is pre-capitalist, that is the idea of the fetish. But insofar as the gift is to be situated outside exchange, and the thought of as embodying pure excess, the capital fetish designates the fantasy of capital as generating a surplus of value in a pure act of giving or transcending the laws of exchange. That's how fashion operates. Editorial fashion, for example. It's not really something that people buy, but ultimately, you know, it does create new value, because then some, you know, larger, more commercial companies knock off, not on the one hand, licensed versions of a certain fashion, but you can see that other kinds of knockoffs occur in a broader kind of commodity market. Fake Louis Vuitton bags, etc. The surplus as an unfathomable gift of capital lies at the core of the capital fetish. So gift and theft effectively form a privileged couple. The occultism of gift has its counterpoint in the evidentialism of theft, which counters the market fanaticism or capital fetishism, while in fact remaining on its terrain, a fact nicely indicated by workers' cooperatives as emblems of so-called market socialism. We constantly talk about, you know, whatever it is, Mondragon in Spain. Under normal circumstances, the evidentialism of theft as a workers' ideology appears, you know, property is theft, appears as if, or wage theft, appears as if the wages no longer suffice to guarantee one's subsistence. It becomes truly palpable, however, in times of crisis, inflation, etc. The ongoing crisis has, in fact, initiated the inversion of the occultism of the gift, of the liberal utopia of eternal growth and never-ending generative capability of capital, into the evidentialism of theft as masses of protesters shouting slogans, thieves, united in a fight against the corrupted capitalist political elites. Now, the thievery at the current moment is more natural in the sense of, you know, we have some expectation about clean water and clean air, and it's being stolen in a variety of ways. So you can see that at an ecological level that can operate. Anyway, so this is this idea of logic of exchange and logic of gift and theft, and it can get pretty intense in this explanation here, but it's worth reading. I mean, it is this idea of kind of displacement, creating difference, you know, and anyway, so it is this question of whether you can create a viable concept of surplus value as this form of displacement, a displacement that becomes detached from the exchange system and not necessarily hoarded, but perhaps just simply moved elsewhere. So the hoarding, the money bin idea, becomes in advanced capital, in the circuit of advanced capital, becomes the other things, you know, stock, bonds, other kinds of things, credit, debt. All of those things are additional ways in which you can talk about a surplus. Some of which are the result of valorization. Others are simply a even more a problematic concept of how interest-bearing capital. Now, of course, the reflection of using a Freudian or a post-Freudian idea is that ultimately it gets back to some very basic elements about the quote-unquote castration. Capital's impotence relies precisely on its proposed productive power potency, right? Production has a male frame to it in that context, rather than well, it can be framed in a more fecund, the idea of fecundity or pregnancy, for example, is a productive power, certainly. But capital fetishism and its Hegelian oppositional determinant, hence evidentialism of theft as the apparent opposite of the occultism of gift, is but the occultism of gift brought to its extreme. In other words, you know, I got it. It was a steal. I got it for a steal. I think that's how you would, you know, talk about it. It was like stealing it, or I got it for a song. It cost a song. So anyway, some points to worry about further on. The idea of interest-bearing capital, I think, is probably the clearest version of this issue of something being developed. And there are other ways in which we can develop the details of this, and the idea of compensating or payment for it makes it even more palpable, one hopes. The idea of either deferred payment or deferred demand, whatever. And it is clearly part of the department too. It is part of consumption. It is it's not simply external, but it continues a certain type of logic. The point that Marx is making, and our author here is making, Hajdini, is the idea that there's a certain structure of demand, a structure of desire at work, and it does conform. The sphere of consumption conforms or adapts to the sphere of circulation. And this sphere of circulation is one of the circuits, is a combination of these circuits. Consumers behaves as a capitalist, aiming not at the consumption of a commodity as a use value, but instead at the consumption of the surplus, at the surplus consumption beyond economic expenditure. So in that sense, you gain more. It's psychic, right? It's psychic benefits. You know, you psychic accumulation. You're happier when you go out and buy something. If you're unhappy, you know, some people go out and buy stuff. The marketing discourse markets surpluses. It promises satisfactions, which, however, never sees in the satisfaction of the need, the promise of satisfaction is reduced to a promise itself as satisfaction. Have it your way. To quote once more, there's Mladen's Dollar. There's a whole thing here on how advertising works, and fulfillment, and you know, it's all the same stuff when you sort of apply a body of Freudian, post-Freudian thought to the same things that we talked about in terms of Bernays, right? The public relations and et cetera. This is all integrated. And yes, of course, there's a relationship between Bernays and Freud, blah, blah, blah. But it's not simply that kind of connection. It is generally in a larger system of how markets operate, promise of satisfaction. Encapsulates the logic of desire situated in the interspace of promise and fulfillment. So you see, there's this kind of what motivation is not fulfillment itself, that is in the exchange of money or the object itself, but rather there's a set of promises. This promissory idea is sort of built in there. Now that may seem too subjective, but you can see that in polling and survey research, you can actually get kinds of collections of these ideas, and there's a whole industry built on this. Desire relies on a promise of fulfillment, which, however, never passes into a fulfillment of purpose, thus keeping desire structurally unfilled. In other words, always, you always leave them wanting more. But this dynamic of desire is inherently redoubled with the logic of the drive, which doesn't rely on the promise of satisfaction, but is satisfied by this promise itself. Along with the glittering new enjoyments, they always try to catch us with the old enjoyment, avarice, the surplus that is intended not for consumption, but for accumulation. So that surplus is built on this. The idea of a surplus value has an additional set of demands built into it, together with the pluses, the new advantage, enjoyment, but also by the minus. That is the saving. The saving is the surplus beyond surplus. So the meta surplus. The first surplus appears as evermore, embodied by the new product. And if you want to think in a dialectic way, the second one appears as ever less, nevertheless offering more. The aura of surplus enjoyment, its attractive packaging, luring the desire into ever new purchases, structurally vanishes with the act of purchase. Buyer's remorse, needless to say. Hence triggering desire's search for ever new surpluses, ever new promises of an eternally delayed and displaced satisfaction. Here, however, we witness a different logic, one redoubling the first one and transforming the surplus as the lever of desire into the object of the drive. This is a fractal-like, that is, it keeps closing in on itself. The object of the drive, which is nothing but a quite literal embodiment of a void, is merely a minus, a savings, a stemming from the very movement of exchange. That is, you just keep, it's a lemming thing. Just as credit money effectively functions as money, even though it is only a promise of payment, so too the promise of satisfaction already functions as satisfaction. In other words, there's some expectation. And this idea of expectation is actually pretty important and can be quantified as the lever of the satisfaction of the drive. So the double nature of the surplus double nature of the surplus corresponds precisely to the formulas of gift and theft. Gift and theft, therefore, because they are oppositional but yet the same, they're displacements of one kind. You give one thing from my possession to another's. Now, where it came from, I may have stolen it somewhere and regifting it to you, that's what regifting in some ways is about. The credit commodity lying at the core of commodities as use values and promising surplus satisfaction, a satisfaction beyond the satisfaction of needs, has the precise structure of the gift received by the customer without having to pay for it. The surplus falls into the consumer's lap as a gift, a result of the productive power of consumption. So, without into the, what he's doing, the author is transposing this into our the general formula of capital, that is CMCP blah 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 M prime. It's the same thing. He's just trying to explain where each operation occurs and why it progresses in that kind of somewhat linear way. But in fact, it's not purely linear. In fact, it's a circuit. It's a system of circuits that move from each moment to another moment. So the alternation corresponds precisely to the passage from the logic of the gift to the logic of theft, or from the formula of capital's fetishism to its perverse inversion. The idea of a perverse inversion, it's perverse. It's perverse because it does always have this a set of contradictions or antagonisms built into it: love, hate, etc. So anyway, and we end there. Let me just read the last. Hence, the movement of the act of purchase doesn't form a closed cycle of need and satisfaction. Instead, it forms a doubly open cycle. That is, this cycle, because it's kind of two circuits at the same time, is traversed by two processes: the economy of desire, sustained by the promise of satisfaction, and unclasping the circle of need by way of being inherently unsatisfied, and a perverse economy of accumulation of savings as an end in itself, forcing us into perpetual renewal of the act of purchase. That's what a subscription is about. However, just as the object of capital is irreducible to a particular sum of money added to the money advanced as it strives for infinite valorization, so too the purpose of the production of savings is irreducible to the sum saved and embodied in the money form, as it instead strives for its mere increase, an increase in savings, hence the interest rate. Hence, the consumerist drive is to be situated beyond needs to wants. The goal of consumption lies beyond the commodity and beyond the savings, striving as it is for the increment, the partial object stemming from the very circulation of exchange. Once again, at the very core of equivalent exchange, there lies repetition as the impossibility of repetition, repetition as the blockage of affirmation, epitomized by the impossibility to translate the money form into the commodity form without a leftover A. That's the petite A in the Lacanian, the diagram of the Lacanian diagram. There's a little small lowercase a in the center. That's what it is. That's actually a very dramatic end to this, and I know that this may not make any sense to you, but I assure you that this actually does make a sort of sense. It's trying to explain using Marx's original terms, it derived from a certain view about history and natural history to get to the idea of what is it that you're trying to do, and the simple examples in semiotics are the uses, for example, of or the unusual examples, and the bird that organizes shiny objects in front of his burrow in order to attract mates. It's sort of an indexical relation rather than not having the the feathers of a peacock or the bright neck feathers. He in fact picks more instrumental means by finding shiny objects to lure a potential mate. And that's very crude example, but these things operate at a variety of kind of behavioral levels. Okay, I'm finished. I just yammered on and on for about the usual amount of time, and perhaps there's questions, comments, interventions.
Actually, if I could meander a bit, because you covered so many concepts. But what started floating through my mind, especially when you were talking about value is a form, not of substance, is something that I've been thinking a lot about. It's kind of meeting up to where my mind is going in a way, because I'm disturbed by what I'm seeing more and more are in these little strip malls, Tide laundromats. And I'm thinking that the company or whatever company has Tide, they're seeing lost opportunity in the form of rent or, borrowing machine, paying for machines. But their capital of sorts is also not the laundry detergent, but the name Tide.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
and and that even goes back, I think it was in the 1980s. At one point, I read it in a book. I can't remember what book, but Tide was um, used as a currency for paying for drugs. Not any laundry detergent, Tide, because it was reliable, quantifiable. Everybody
Oh,
needed
yeah.
it, you know.
It's a token. It functions as a token in that sense. Yes.
Yeah. And so, but, so I'm looking at Tide, the name Tide, and how it's, used in so many different ways as a form of value. And, my imagination is just taking it to, and I find it, and this really isn't on your topic. Well, it's, creating
No,
desire. You mentioned,
no, it is. It is actually. I
yeah,
recall that, and this was not in any communication class. This, I think, was an English class in high school. We were talking about Freudian. There is some analysis somewhere. It's a relatively primitive analysis that the Tide box actually is it has certain erotic implications, and I don't believe that analysis, but the fact that it even comes up in terms of talking about advertising is an interesting idea.
yeah. I mean, it's amazing the different facets of the name Tide, but also they're creating, we're talking about creating desire, and I would extend that to creating need, like, Steve Jobs did with the Apple phone or iPhone. They're creating need to borrow the machines and pay for, not borrow, but rent the machines. Um, you know, um, because the the machines, if you had the wherewithal to own a machine, which is common, in our society, um, you need to be a homeowner, and have, $700 at least to pay for a stupid machine. That's not that complicated. It's
Yes.
not. And so, they're creating this need to go to, these, I don't know how the Tide laundromat is different from any other laundromat, but it's name brand, you've got that connection with your laundry. And then I just, another facet in my life, I'm going to keep this short. Um, when I taught English, I remember asking a question I knew the answer to. I thought I knew the answer to, but does everybody like to do laundry, as far as building conversation to work on their
Oh,
English?
yes. Yes.
And I got a almost 100% response of emphatic yes.
Huh.
And what I learned was the way we do laundry is so much easier and is a delight compared to walking miles with dirty clothes to a river that's not so clean, and then walking miles back with your arms and shoulders covered with wet clothes back to your village, using rocks. And so they schooled me. But anyway, I'm getting off topic, but thank you so much.
Well, it is interesting, the evolution of you don't have a river, you need a big, a wide, a bucket, or what is it called? Whatever, a wash, uh,
Tub, tub,
a wash tub. That's it. And then you have what the hell are they called? You know,
plunger.
No. The
Washboard.
Washboard?
washboard. Yes, the washboard that
Mhm.
you would rub. In other words, you replace the river and rocks with a wash tub and a washboard. That's
Mhm.
and uh, well, I'm old enough to have had to recall in my youth the fact that we had one of those crank ringers on our
A mangle.
Oh,
you
yeah.
know,
Mango.
Yeah.
uh,
Um,
it's
right.
just interesting to see how that how these things operate. But
Mhm.
yeah, you're right that it is an improvement, and the whole rise of appliances, the idea of appliances in the early 20th century is that huge domestic, the formation of the domestic market for the home, the home as factory, right? Um,
Mhm. Yeah.
uh,
And it
and
always was. I mean, that was Mondays, right?
yes,
Often, yeah, wash days didn't, I think Tuesdays were ironing or something,
right. No, exactly.
Yeah.
It was organizing your own little assembly line. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
uh, I think I've come
Yeah,
across.
and in the early 20th century, the podcasts they had to listen to were really boring while you were doing your laundry. Well, I was just going to say the other Tide reference when you talk about the box. I was thinking of, oh, then there's also the Andy Warhol art that he made out of the Tide box by both commenting on commercialism as the icon of the Tide box, but also then using the icon of the Tide box to then create something that's actually worth quite a bit more than an actual Tide box.
Oh boy. Yeah, you're right. So right.
Uh-huh.
So right.
Yes.
Yeah. And one more plug. Get a clothesline if anybody has.
Oh, indeed,
Let's
energy saving.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
let's ditch the dryers. Anyway, thank you.
Absolutely.
I don't know. I'll try.
It's a whole system of things, though. The idea that, as I've mentioned before, probably the idea that certain appliances, are meant to take advantage of the evening hours when electricity is quote unquote cheaper or more abundant, and that evens out the demand for stuff. And of course, we see the problems of it relative to air conditioning, brownouts, whatever. So I apologize for dragging this out. I think it's a useful article because it gets at the details of how is it that we always try to maximize a certain type of value? What's behind it? And that's kind of the whole business of the reason why I did this. And also to show that it links together all of these different ideas. That is, Zizek and his interest in Lacan and Hegel, actually come back together in this. And it can be applied in a broad range of actions and activities. And yes, it has been for decades. The Lacanian analysis of advertising goes back for a while, but it still is with us. And I think that we need to remind ourselves that this is just another core of the problem that, was originally brought to us by Freud, but took its own little kind of weird path with Freud about, conceptualizing certain kinds of, or stereotyping or archetyping certain kinds of things. And so I think it's still applicable in terms of trying to talk about capital and to talk about these various capital forms that allow people to, and not just have money bins, they have other stuff. Or it allows Trump to be the king of debt. He calls himself the king of debt. It's like really weird.
What would you think of a branded money bin?
I don't know. Remember that the McDuck money bin has a big dollar sign on it.
Right.
Oh,
And just to be clear, trying to dive into a giant bin of coins,
not a
you
good
can't
idea.
you
You're gonna
can't
hurt
swim
yourself.
around in that. No,
You're gonna hurt.
you will break your 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 wrists and other bones.
But
It's
isn't
not
Those
money?
cartoons
money.
are
It's
not
not a
But
liquid.
Well, but
realistic.
that it is a kind of weird fantasy, and you can project that to the ball pits at what, McDonald's, right?
Yeah, that's true. No, diving. Yeah.
You dive into the ball pit, whatever, and bouncy castles and whatever. Anyway, so much for
Well,
feudal
there's
fantasies.
Well, with
there's
regard
a
to advertising, would you say that Bernays had the secret sauce?
ooh, I was waiting for someone to make some kind of joke like that.
There we go.
Where's John Hayes? Where is he?
Where Hayes?
No, we need a rim shot on
Shut
you.
Well, and thanks for introducing me to the Marxian importance of Scrooge McDuck. I wasn't familiar with the story. Are
What?
there any other Disney vehicles that I should be abreast of?
Well, I mean,
Ala-
the literature.
Aladdin.
Yeah, indeed. Well, there is a literature actually. The Madelart and Kunzel did a whole thing about how to read Donald Duck, and in Chile, you would explain. It was a way of explaining capitalism or business to children by using McDuck, etc. So there's actually a literature for this that's been around for decades.
But is there a pro-capitalist analysis of Scrooge McDuck where he's actually the hero because he is the job creator?
Yeah, no, that's the deal. Is the analysis is a pro-capitalist.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Yeah. Not a Marxist. Oh, it's a Marxist analysis of a capitalist educational program. Let's put it that way.
Ah, got it. Job creator.
Well, you mentioned Trump and buying furniture. I hope he doesn't find out about those gas ottoman beds. That'd be a real bad combination, I think.
I hope he does.
Well, only if he gets into one of them.
Exactly.
Oh, right. Yes. Not too likely. Ugh.
Okay, I put it in the chat, the reference. You see, it goes back to the 70s.
What's that, Trump and furniture?
No, reading Donald Duck, although Trump and furniture probably goes back to the 80s. No, it's in one of the biographies. He brags about, that he prefers married women, very James Bond-like. That his preference is to seduce married women, and in particular, Trump. It was a power thing because he'd always want to do it over his wives of his friends or business associates.
Oh, God.
That actually makes sense.
Yeah, and his ploy is, of course,
Classic.
buying furniture.
Cuckold, classic cuckolding. Yes.
Yep.
Makes sense. Totally. It scans, as they say.
Okay, well, I thank you for your attention. We'll have another version of this craziness for Weekly Marx tomorrow at 3, and then back to the weekday 5 o'clock the business of this and that.